I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the first episode of 2015. It's a little bit late out the gate. It's probably going to be the 7th or 8th by the time this makes it to your ears. This will be episode number 59 in this podcast dedicated to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. In this episode, we're going to be talking about something non-nootropic, something you've probably heard of, and if you've seen the movie Inception, you've certainly been exposed to the concept of lucid dreaming, a dream where you are aware within the dream that you are dreaming. For those of you who have experienced this already, it's something that's pretty neat, just like a really unique brain state that I think is worth chasing, maybe for those of you who haven't already gotten to experience this. We're going to be talking with one of the world's leading experts both on dreams in general and lucid dreams in particular, Dr. Deirdre Barrett from Harvard, who's one of these lucky people who's had a lifelong interest in dreams and has managed to construct a career around that. So I think despite the non-pharmaceutical nature of the conversation that we're about to have, it's a really interesting topic and worth a little departure from the normal offering. If you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to let you know why it might be worth going down to your local McDonald's and kidnapping a bunch of school children for the sake of protecting their brains. I probably shouldn't say that. I probably shouldn't be fomenting the kidnapping of children, but that's what we're going to be talking about in the ruthless listener retention gimmick at the end of the episode. But for now, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
I feel like all of This Week in Neurosciences are always incredibly good news or incredibly bad news, and there's very few that are kind of neutral. This is in the incredibly good news category. A research team at Northwestern University is apparently well on the way to discovering a way of detecting Alzheimer's very early, way before the point where actual pathology would be starting to take place that anybody would notice, before the overt signs of Alzheimer's, of confusion, dementia, forgetfulness, all those things would actually show up in a person. There are some biomarkers that up until now there hasn't been a way to detect, and there hasn't even necessarily been full agreement on what those early biomarkers are, but there seems to be increasing consensus that something called mobile amyloid beta oligomers are molecules within the brain that take place in the very early stages of Alzheimer's, attacking the synapses of neurons, destroying memory, and ultimately resulting in neuron death. As time progresses, these amyloid beta oligomers build up and start to stick together, forming the plaques that the current probes looking for Alzheimer's target. But these oligomers may appear more than a decade before the plaques are detectable. So neuroscientist William L. Klein and material scientist Vinayak P. Dravid teamed up to develop a magnetic nanostructure, typically on the order of 10 to 15 nanometers in diameter. 1 nanometer is a billionth of a meter, so this is incredibly, incredibly small. When they talk about nanotechnology, this is the size scale that they're talking about. And these magnetic nanostructures, which they gave to Alzheimer's model mice using a nasal spray. So they haven't done this in humans yet, but they've got Alzheimer's mice that they use this sort of thing for testing on. So they got these magnetic nanostructures into their brains, which basically identify and bond to these amyloid beta oligomers, and then use MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, to detect where the magnetic nanostructures wind up clumped. And if they see clumps of these things, those appear as dark spots in the MRI, which on the control group of mice, the brains did not have any dark spots. On the Alzheimer's mice, they did. They would see these clumps of magnetic nanostructures and they'd say, aha, something's going on here. These early warning, despicable little molecules are present in the mouse brain. And while not the focus of this particular study, the study was just about finding a way of identifying way early Alzheimer's compared to current technology. But what's really interesting is that by binding to these toxins, the magnetic nanostructures also kind of handcuffed them biochemically and kept them from producing as much damage as they would. So there's the possibility here that this might not only lead to early identifications, but possibly another treatment methodology if there's a way of looking for these chemicals that are causing damage early on and keeping them from causing that damage. So a lot of things that seem really, really promising about this study. The details of this study are published in the journal Nature Nanotechnology under the title Towards Non-Invasive Diagnostic Imaging of Early-Stage Alzheimer's Disease.
Smart Drug Smarts.
In Closer to Home news, picked up 3 5-star reviews on iTunes in the past week plus since the last episode from Freedom is Fun, Busy Spider, and Illuminati, respectively. Some of these got pretty long, so I'm going to just go to the high points. But Freedom is Fun said that this is a superb podcast with a wealth of info for anyone who wants to improve how their brain works. Busy Spider said that Jesse and Rhiannon, via the Smart Drug Smarts e-newsletters, never fail to share compelling content consistently and in a very consumable way, whether the listener is a layperson or medical professional. And Illuminati said, a few years ago I suffered a traumatic brain injury and ever since have become obsessed with anything and everything that can help with some of the cognitive issues I've been dealing with. This podcast is great because although there are others that focus on brain function and biohacking in general, this one goes right to the essence of what I'm looking for. What can I do to help my brain function at the highest level it can? Thank you very much to all of you who took the time to submit those reviews. Really very, very much appreciated. And somewhat by way of a pre-preview, actually, Illuminati further in the review said that he or she, I'm not sure which, appreciated the fact that up to this point we have been a non-commercial podcast, not trying to sell anything to our audience. Fair warning that coming down on the road in the not terribly distant future, I actually do want to start doing some things to monetize the podcast because I'd really like to be able to devote even more time than I am and put a little bit more manpower and muscle behind everything that I want to do with Smart Drug Smarts. And needless to say, money helps make those things happen. So for those of you that hate any smack of commerciality in all things, apologies in advance, but hopefully the majority of you will be modestly forgiving. And who knows, maybe we'll be selling something you want. It won't be garden trowels. It won't be ninja Halloween costumes. It'll be something right up your alley. Speaking of which, I spoke recently with two-time Smart Drug Smarts alumnus Dr. Terry Walls, whose book, The Walls Protocol, just came out at the very tail end of 2014 in paperback edition. So for those of you who enjoyed either of the episodes there where she was talking about how her particular brand of a paleo-esque diet really transformed her life and her own experience with multiple sclerosis and is doing the same thing with others, check out that book. We will put up a link on the website, of course. So Dr. Deirdre Barrett is an author and psychologist who teaches at Harvard Medical School. She's known for her research on dreams, hypnosis, and hypnagogic imagery, and has written on evolutionary psychology as well. In the past, she was president for the International Association for the Study of Dreams. And she's written 4 books for the public: The Pregnant Man and Other Tales from a Hypnotherapist's Couch, The Committee of Sleep, Wasteland, and Supernormal Stimuli. And she's also editor-in-chief of the journal Dreaming. I really wanted to do this interview because I'd heard anecdotally a few times about people using dreams for the exploration of ideas and sort of problem solving and incubating complex problems, scientists that are trying to solve theorems that have been bedeviling them in their waking hours and things of that nature, and was kind of wondering, hey, is there a cognitive hack involved in dreaming and in lucid dreaming in particular, where it seems that we'd have more conscious control of the kind of stuff we're thinking about? I've had a couple points in my life where I've been really into lucid dreaming and have gone to great lengths to try to increase the number of lucid dreams that I had in any given week, but at those times I was never really trying to accomplish anything in my lucid dreams other than having lucid dreams and flying around and getting into imaginative fun in this playground universe. But now that I'm doing Smart Drug Smarts and I'm thinking about cognitive hacks, I kind of wanted to revisit the topic. So anyway, let's dive in with Dr. Barrett.
I was always interested in dreams. I think that most people who go into studying it professionally recall more dreams than average, and or have more vivid dreams than typical. And that was certainly true of me. So I was interested in dreams at age 5 or 6.
I think almost everybody knows what lucid dreaming is now since the movie Inception, but can you give a quick synopsis for anybody that's not on the bandwagon?
Yes. The most standardly accepted definition is simply that it's a dream in which you're dreaming while you're dreaming. And there are a few psychologists who add further specifications that you need to be able to change the dream content at will, or other things that are a little bit more demanding definitions. But most of us sort of make those extra characteristics that a lucid dream may or may not have and just define it as knowing you're dreaming while the dream is in progress.
One question that I had is, other than asking somebody after the fact, hey, were you lucid in that dream? Is there any way that from the outside looking at a dreamer's brain, we can tell that there's like any distinct markers from normal dream state versus lucid dream state?
Well, the one time when it's crystal clear is Steve LaBerge and a couple of other researchers have trained some people to eye signal when they're lucid dreaming, to give little Morse code type signals with their eyes as soon as they realize they're dreaming. So that's a clear message to the outside world that one can see. But other than that, the state of lucid dreaming is on average a bit different than other rapid eye movement sleep, which is the period in which dreams and lucid dreams are occurring. Generally, in rapid eye movement sleep, the area just behind our forehead, called the prefrontal cortex, is much less active than when we're awake. Overall, we have as much brain activity, but some areas are more active during dreaming, like our visual cortex, and other areas are less active, including that prefrontal cortex. And in lucid dreaming, the prefrontal cortex shows somewhat more activity again. On average, it's more active than in most dreams, but still not as active as when we're awake. So someone watching an EEG in a sleep lab might guess better than chance if someone might be lucid based on an unusual amount of prefrontal activity, but there's no clear-cut way unless you have somehow trained the subjects to be giving you some signal.
Signaling with eye movement, that's actually a really ingenious technique. That's actually one question I had about dreaming in general is when you go to sleep, normally your body sort of switches off. If you're dreaming about punching somebody or running up a hill, it's like you're not making those movements with your arms and legs, but your eyes still are obviously responsive to what you're thinking about looking at within the dreams. Has there been any research as to how the brain manages to turn off almost all of your body parts except for your eye muscles?
Yes, there's one little area deep in our brain that is rather actively sending a signal to paralyze muscle movement. And in the late 50s, a French psychologist, Michael Jouvet, established that that was going on with some experiments with cats where he would go in and lesion this area that was suspected of being the control. And there still exists these old videos of his cats who look completely normal by day, and at night they go to sleep, and they sleep until they come to their first rapid eye movement period, and then they, still eyes closed, they leap up and pounce on things and stalk. Just look like they're hunting mice through their rapid eye movement period. And then they flop back down and sleep through the non-REM part of the cycle. And then they leap around again when they're in rapid eye movement sleep. So that was what pretty much proved it. And there's a rare disorder in humans called REM behavior disorder, where people act out their dreams in some or all of their REM periods. And it's actually quite dangerous in humans. They can easily hurt themselves or other people. And fortunately, it's much rarer than garden variety sleepwalking, which occurs during non-dreaming sleep.
Could you go into that for a second about how sleepwalking is during non-dreaming sleep? Like what actually is going on, if not a dream, when that's happening?
Not too much brain-wise. I mean, upper brain-wise. Most sleepwalkers, if awakened while they're sleepwalking, don't remember anything, or they'll remember a vague, they're trying to get to the bathroom, or they have some slight reason for their movement, but they're not hallucinating a full world around them and things as if they were dreaming. So the brain is not nearly as active during that stage of sleep, and most sleepwalkers get up and move relatively slowly. It's rare for any of them to unlock doors and leave their houses, but they also don't jump at panes of glass very often. I mean, there are a few sleepwalkers who've been badly injured in their sleep, but for the extremely high rate of sleepwalking, it's a pretty low injury rate. But moving around during your dreams, the brain is just so much more active, including its motor part that's telling you to move constantly in all directions. So you're way likelier to get injured.
So as far as lucid dreaming, other than pure entertainment value, which obviously being able to sort of control the world you're hallucinating around you gives you lots of opportunities for doing cool stuff, have you seen people put lucid dreaming to particular uses? Are there people that are using it for accomplishing things in the real world, whether it's solving problems or anything like that?
In addition to what you'd call just pure entertainment, there's certainly people who feel like, in a somewhat related way, that it's just a growth, consciousness expanding, that being able to realize that your brain is manufacturing everything you're seeing around you in a lucid dream just makes more real for people the idea that our regular waking perceptions are not just exact, direct input. So there are a lot of sort of understandings of physics and sort of Buddhist insight that people feel like they get from that state. And I'm not sure there's a sharp line between the recreational and that aspect. But then for the really kind of practical benefits, I think that people that naturally easily have a lot of lucid dreams, can apply them in some very practical ways, but that for most people, the idea that if you have nightmares, you might learn to become lucid to be able to stop having the nightmares or change their content or wake up from them, or that you might problem solve in a lucid dream if you could learn to be lucid, that actually it's easier to influence our dreams in just about any way other than lucidity, which is about the hardest, probably because it requires that prefrontal activation that most dreaming doesn't have, whereas as to set a goal, like the next time I start having that nightmare, I want to wake up immediately, or I want the monster chasing me to shrink down to a tiny bug size, or I want to turn around and ask the monster what it represents. Those goals are actually easier because they only need some memory areas that are actually still active during dreaming. So if you're trying to problem solve in a dream, it's actually much more efficient to simply tell yourself as you're falling asleep, I want to dream a useful solution to X, and kind of repeat that over and over and visualize something associated with it. And when people do that with really simple problems, in some of my research, I found that in the course of 1 week of trying that, about half of people will have a dream on the topic of their problem, and about half of those will have a dream that solves it. And it's not that high as problems get more and more difficult, but the 50% will dream on the topic seems to hold up. Whereas 1 week of people who haven't been having many lucid dreams won't produce as high a success rate. Getting lucid is just harder. So when people think, oh, I should learn lucidity to be able to change my nightmares or do problem solving in dreams or whatever, it's usually making the task harder to insist that you become lucid prior to these other changes in your dreams.
Tell us about the training methods that people do use if they want to gain skill in achieving lucidity.
The best way to have more lucid dreams is a combination of things to do at bedtime and things to do by day. And at bedtime, the things that are helpful to increase the rate of lucid dreaming are pretty much the same kind of self-suggestions that you would do if you're trying to change your dreams in any other way. Because we can do self-suggestion, dream incubation to increase our rate of recall, or to dream on a particular topic, or to change nightmares. But you can also self-suggest at bedtime, tonight in my dreams, I want to know that I'm dreaming. And if you've had lucid dreams in the past, perhaps replay one of those, especially the moment when you realize that this was a dream. If you've never had a lucid dream, but you see an Inception sort of picture, the scene where the architect is realizing for the first time that this is a dream. Because our dreams are so visual that some sort of visual imagery helps reinforce the suggestion. But just saying that to yourself verbally, and kind of whatever imagery or memory may make that more vivid for you, do that just as you're falling asleep every night. And that's an important part of it. And that part is very similar to what you do to influence your dreams in other ways. But then specific to lucidity, the other technique that's the most helpful, at least of any of the low-tech kinds of things that you can do, is by day to come up with what we call a reality check, to ask yourself the question, am I awake or dreaming right now, periodically through the day? And actually, even just asking that is somewhat helpful to eventually becoming lucid in your dreams. But it's much more powerful if you come up with a reality check that is something you identify as working differently awake versus when you are dreaming. And none of these are completely universal for everyone, but there's some that commonly work for many people. Like, most people can't read completely normally in their dreams.
Right. Yeah. The text changes around every time you look back at it.
Yeah. For some people, text is never coherent and makes sense. Other people, they can read something short, but if they look away and look back, it will say something different. For many people to locate something written, read it and look away, look back, really carefully note if it says the same thing. That's a good one for a lot of people, although there are exceptions. There are few people who really just can read in their dreams. Clocks are very similar. Most of the time in a dream, if you look at a clock, whether it's a digital or an old analog clock, it won't say something that's a clear real time, or if it does and you look away and look back, it will not have moved simply 1 minute or nothing ahead. It will, it will do something different.
The people who you find can read normally or as close to normally as possible in dreams, do you see any commonality among these groups of people? When you see these subdivisions in lucid dreamers of this person can do this person can't do that, do those map to any other things that you might typify those people as being one way or the other?
Yeah, it's usually people who are much better at and do a lot more of something awake. Like it's often professional writers who really read a fair bit of stuff in their dreams. And most of us can't add simple numbers in our dreams. Numbers are rare in our dreams, but when they occur, we're very confused about simple arithmetic. But mathematicians can do higher math in their dreams. And music is rare in most people's dreams, but musicians have a lot. So it's often the whatever you do the most with by day, whatever you have the most adept with, the area of your brain that is just the most developed is likelier to be functioning better than it does for other people. I mean, dreams, rather universally, unless you are blind, visual imagery is a big part of most people's dreams. But some of the other modalities vary much more with how constantly you're using them awake.
That's an interesting question. What are dreams like for people who are born blind? Is it purely auditory? And I imagine the parts of their brain that would normally be allocated to visual stuff get rewired to something else, whether it's hearing or whatever. What do we know about the dreams of blind people?
Yeah, they're auditory, they're tactile. I mean, it's almost meaningless to say whether they have any visual element. They wouldn't have words for that. Blind people certainly have a spatial sense. They are often sensing if they're in a small or large room or outdoors or indoors, or objects in front of them and how far in front of them they are. But they get all those cues off sound and touch and things like that. So the area that's visual is still doing spatial location, but not in the usual visual sense.
In the visual sense, yeah.
Now, what's maybe more interesting is that people that go blind very early, but nevertheless experience sight for their first 2 or 3 or 4 years, they tend to continue to have lots and lots of visual imagery in their dream, even though in their waking state they've gotten to where they are hyperacute in their other senses and navigating, and certainly the brain has reorganized somewhat, but they tend to still see things in their dreams.
Interesting. So that's got to be easy for them to get into lucidity, because that is going to be a great tip-off that something is not like their normal waking life.
That's an interesting point. That would be the ideal cue. But back to some of those cues, one thing I notice in my dreams is that there's sort of no such thing as imagining something without it happening. So if when I'm awake, I can sort of picture the desk in front of me lifting up, and I sort of have an image of that, but on the other hand, I can still see the real desk sitting where it's really sitting. And in a dream, there's no such thing for me as imaging something that's not happening. If I try to imagine the desk floating up, it might just stay in place and I could get no image, but more likely it would actually float up. That's a test I use, but again, that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. But light switches do not usually work normally in dreams. So most people, if they flip light switches, locate a light switch, go to it, turn it on or off, the lighting either doesn't change at all, or there's quite a delay before it changes, or it dims or brightens slightly, but not nearly as much as it would. So that's a good one. But anyway, back to the general principle, you pick 1 or 2 of these things that reliably is different in your dream versus awake, And then you make a point of periodically through the day. Some people can do it just when they think of it. If you find you're not thinking of it, you can set your watch to beep at you and tell you certain times to do your reality check. And you just seriously ask yourself if it seems like you're awake, if everything seems completely normal. In a general sense, check that out. And then do your look for a light switch or look for reading material and do your test. And it's hard to get yourself to take this seriously and really do it. But if you do, first of all, it's a kind of interesting experience by day to really just for a moment think what makes you so sure you're awake right now and seriously check for anything bizarre that might be a sign of dreaming. But then what it does with dreams is just about any new habit that we're practicing by day tends to make its way into our dreams eventually. So if you do this consistently enough by day, eventually in a dream, you'll remember it's time to do your reality check and think it's kind of silly, but I'm going through the motions and wait a minute, the light switch doesn't work.
Yeah, that's great. One question I've got is, so we see in movies all the time the sort of horrific scenario of being trapped in a dream but unable to wake up. Does that ever actually really happen to anybody where somebody might realize they're dreaming but not be able to snap themselves out of it? I've lucid dreamed a lot at some points in my life, and I've always found it a very fragile state. If I'm lucky, I can maintain it for a while, but oftentimes not very long after I realize I'm dreaming, something will wake me up out of it, and it just doesn't last as long as I would like it to. Do people ever have the opposite problem?
Well, I mean, most people in lucid dreams are not trying to wake themselves up. They're trying to stay in the lucid dream. So the problem you mentioned having is infinitely more common, that they're wanting to stay in the dream and they're feeling themselves waking up from it. It is fragile because the brain probably is a little more activated and a little closer to waking when you're having a lucid dream. But back to your original question, I certainly have heard of people describing that they're lucid and they start wanting to wake up and they can't immediately. And although most lucid dreams are very, very pleasant, even though the average dream is, in general, is slightly the negative side of neutral, the average lucid dream is really positive. But there are some scary lucid dreams, and there are some people who are wanting to wake up because they're scared, and if they can't immediately, that's more scary yet. So I've heard a few dreams that are a little bit like that image in the horror movies, except unlike the horror movies, I don't think the experience really goes on for more than a minute or two.
That raises the question of the perception of time within dreams being all over the map. Are there any consistent rules about how long something feels in a dream versus how long it actually is?
It's definitely not the Inception things that it's consistently distorted. On average, it doesn't seem to be particularly distorted. There are two studies that were both done 2 or 3 decades back, but in sleep labs where they would have people go into rapid eye movement sleep, let them continue in that for differing amounts of time, wake them up while they were still in rapid eye movement sleep, and then they would ask them what they were dreaming and how long it felt like that dream had taken. And it correlated very closely with how long they'd been in REM. On average, there was a good correlation. Now, these were both done with relatively few subjects for just a night or two in a lab. And I have certainly heard people tell me of dreams that just felt like some sort of epic where they felt like they'd lived a lifetime in one night. So it's not an absolute that you can't have time distortion in either direction, and I think it's somewhat likelier to be the seeming longer than it actually took. But that seems to be more the exception than the rule, that in general, you were probably dreaming for about as long as the dream feels like.
So sleep cycles are typically and kind of famously around 90 minutes, and only a small piece of that is REM sleep. How long is the REM sleep section normally, which I guess would sort of demarcate how long a dream could normally be at its greatest length?
Well, you're completely correct that every 90 minutes we go into rapid eye movement sleep, but then it lasts for very different amounts of time as the night goes on. The first period of REM sleep is just a few minutes, like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. And then we go back into non-REM. But the second one becomes longer. And if you sleep 8 hours and have 5 REM periods, the last one is likely to last something like 20 minutes or just a bit longer than that. So in fairly normal sleep, that's as long as it gets. But some people who get very sleep deprived and sleep for 12 or 14 hours, the REM periods will keep getting longer and longer. So in that sort of unusual situation, you can get REM periods that are 35, 40, 45 minutes long.
So for the people out there that have not yet experienced a lucid dream, it certainly sounds interesting, but there are some experiences that you have them, it's interesting the first time, and then it's like, you know what, I never really need to do that again. Like I went skydiving. I was super excited to go skydiving. The first time I went skydiving, it was a blow my mind experience. And then I did it second, third time. I was like, it was basically the same as the first time, only 90% boringer. How do you find that people respond to lucid dreaming as they get used to it? Is it something that has staying power as far as keeping people interested? Or do some people do it once and like, I don't see what the fuss is?
Not once, but I've only heard this sort of losing interest in it from people at the real high end of the continuum, and not even all of them, but I've heard a few people who are capable of having lucid dreams any night they will themselves to very reliably, who really can have one or more lucid dreams a night and stay in them for quite a while. I've heard some of those people say that they've grown less interested in that and that they feel like their regular dreams where they don't realize they're dreaming and they're sort of more absorbed in the reality of whatever drama is going on, that they kind of prefer not to be lucid because there becomes something more interesting about their regular dreams compared to lucid dreaming. But like I say, I've only heard that from people who really achieve a very unusual amount of lucidity. And I can't quite identify with it. I mean, when I work real hard at it, I have maybe one lucid dream a week. But if I'm not doing all the incubation techniques spontaneously, I would maybe have 2 to 4 a year. And so what I think the vast majority of people who have lucid dreams, but not every night, experience is that it still stays very vivid and very special, and it's this really unique state of consciousness that you never get to have very much of, and so it certainly never feels like, enough of that.
Do you find with the people that are naturally gifted at lucid dreaming that there's any other commonalities among those groups of people? Like, are they suggestible with hypnosis? Is there anything else that might also characterize that group?
That's a good guess because, we've tried that, and there's a modest correlation with hypnotizability, but it's a very modest one. And I'd say in the really unusual people I've ever seen, I've met 2 people who said that all of their dreams were always lucid, and others who say, something like 90 to 95% are. And I would say that all of those people either had something in the range of bipolar, manic depressive disorder, if not completely diagnosable, sort of tending toward that, and or slept really unusual amounts, way in excess of 8 hours a night. But I haven't met enough for that to be a statistical. Like I say, I've only met 2 ever who said all of their lucid dreams.
Right. And since you're a professional sleep scientist, if anybody's going to meet people like this, it's going to be you. So there's probably not that many of them. Now, earlier you mentioned techniques for generating dreams in sort of the non-technical ways. Tell us about the technical ways. What does science have in the way of promoting a dream state?
Just been developed in the last few years is a low-level electrical stimulation of the brain. They're both techniques for magnetic stimulation, one of which has gotten approved and licensed for treating depression, to pulse magnetic stimulation into certain areas that regulate mood. And that might have some potential to activate the prefrontal cortex, but except that the magnetic version makes some noise, which would tend to wake you up. So what's been tried so far is electrical stimulation. And it also has some problems with the fact that it makes the skin tingle to sting a little bit, which is not enough to be a problem in its waking applications, but is enough to potentially wake people up. And there have been 3 published studies trying to use the electrical version of stimulation on the prefrontal cortex during REM sleep to make people have lucid dreams. And the first 2 published as failing to do so, and mainly because they woke too many people up. And the third one, which was Ursula Voss, was one of the 2 authors, sort of phrased itself much more as a success, but that was only because instead of making having a really clear-cut lucid dream the criteria for success, they woke people up, asked them to recount, and then either they or the subjects had rated the dreams on sort of how much thinking and reflection and reality testing type thought had gone on, and they found more of this, quote, lucid-like thinking. But actually none of them were saying, oh, I'm dreaming. They were just showing somewhat more prefrontal-like activity. So that one hasn't gotten really far yet, but I'm sure that somebody is going to figure out how to just release a little bit of Novocaine at the time that you're doing the stimulation so that you're not stinging the person and waking them up. And theoretically, both the magnetic and the electrical stimulation seem like they have the potential to do that. They're already being used to stimulate other brain areas to just be somewhat more active in a safe, normal range way, and I'm almost sure that one or both of those eventually will be doing something for inducing lucidity during rapid eye movement sleep.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you very much to Dr. Barrett for taking the time for that interview. I had a lot of fun with that. I'm actually kind of re-inspired to take the time necessary to do a little bit more dream incubation and dream journaling and that kind of stuff that makes it easier to recall your dreams and occasionally notice that you are dreaming. One thing that I wanted to add is sort of my personal method that I would use as a reality check, which I found to be highly effective and kind of great fun, and it's a really simple one, is to check and see if you're dreaming. Just give a little hop in the air, and if you can make yourself stay aloft even a fraction of a little bit longer than it seems like you should be able to, then hey, you're dreaming. And what was nice about that as sort of my reality check was if I hopped and it felt like, hey, I can stay aloft, then it would very easily lead to a flight dream. It's like I would take a jump, then I would take a bigger jump, then I would take a bigger jump, and it was kind of like a leapfrogging thing, and soon I would be having a flying dream, which is always great fun. So as usual, if you've got any ways to check if you're dreaming, I'd love to get an email from you and hear what other people are up to. I'll share that in a future episode. Jesse@SmartDrugSmarts is the email address. And now let's do the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So let me tell you, it is difficult to do a podcast about brains and cognition without talking a lot about nutrition. Because honestly, I don't know. I've always been a little bit nutrition focused. I'm a second generation nutritional health kind of geek, thanks to my dad. But nutrition is just such a cornerstone of how everything else in our life works. And our cognition seems to be no exception. So if it seems like I talk a lot about things that you may or may not want to be eating or drinking, please forgive me. It's such an important topic. And so now I'm going to beat up on fast food a little bit because researchers at Ohio State University have recently released findings showing that school-age children who eat fast food tend to perform worse on academic tests than kids who don't. And immediately when I read this, my little bit of knowledge about causation versus correlation kicked in, and I thought, well, what are some of the other factors that might be involved here? Is it that the parents who feed their kids a lot of fast food are parents who don't have a lot of time and so they don't give as much attention to their children's education? Maybe these are latchkey kids, maybe they're poorer socioeconomic kids and that's why they're eating junk food, and the poorer socioeconomic stuff has other effects that would be related to how the kids performed academically, and so maybe the fast food is just a independent variable and isn't causing anything. But no, according to this study, they took into account over 24 other factors that could could skew the results. Things like those I just mentioned. And even after factoring all those things out, the kids that were eating a lot of meals at fast food restaurants were scoring measurably worse on academic tests than those who weren't. This was taken from a representative sample of 8,500 school kids whose fast food consumption was measured at the age of 10 and then compared against their academic test results 3 years later. The kids were asked how many times they'd eaten a meal or a snack from a fast food restaurant, including places like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Burger King, and KFC. On science tests, the daily fast food eaters scored an average of 79 points compared to 83 points among those kids who never ate fast food. Similar differences in academic achievement were observed on reading and math tests. But yeah, that's over a 5% discrepancy in test results, which seems significant enough that it should be taken as kind of a big deal. So if you got kids, or even if you have a brain, just because they've tested this on kids doesn't mean it's not doing similar things to all the rest of us. Take that into account the next time that you're about to scarf down some McNuggets and fries or whatever.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode. Next, episode number 60, getting into the 60s. If you liked what you heard here, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast syndicator of choice. The show notes for this episode and all episodes will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I realize that I'm starting to sound antiquated by still saying www. That's so anachronistic of me. I apologize, and will try to restrain myself in the future. I'll be back at you next week. In fact, I've got another interview scheduled in just 2 days. This is the long-awaited marijuana episode interview, coming back from the brink of thinking it was not going to happen. That's not necessarily going to be episode 60. In fact, that'll probably be number 61. But you never know. Things flip-flop. Times are a-changin'. But I will be back at you incredibly soon with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.